So I am Stacey Landry. I'm the Director of Gift Planning and Advisor Relations at ECCF, and I am joined by several of my colleagues here at the Community Foundation. If you guys can see everybody, I don't know, maybe wave, Stratton, everybody say hi. So the crew is all here, and I share that really just to let you know how excited we are for today's presentation, as it marks really a new effort for us to reach out and support nonprofits in Essex County in a way that we think is increasingly important and timely. I'll also mention that around the Zoom room today, we have representatives from nonprofits all across Essex County, some large and established, some smaller and newer. We have executive directors, development directors, board members, and trustees. There are hunger-related organizations and those representing the arts and health of all kinds. And it's encouraging to see this beautiful spectrum of the nonprofit community represented, because if there's one thing that we've learned in the last 8 months, and I know we've learned many, many things, it's that the nonprofit community is essential. The pandemic that we're all still responding to on a daily basis has forced all of us as nonprofits to consider and reassess the financial health of our organizations, how we're capitalized, and how we're planning for the future. And we're excited to offer a way to partner with you and to support you in your efforts. Now, whether you already have an endowment fund that is invested elsewhere, or you have a savings account that's earmarked for a rainy day, we as your community foundation are here to help you. And because there are a broad array of nonprofits represented, we know we can't possibly touch on every possible scenario as you're considering more and as you learn more today. So really, please consider this as an introduction and an overview to nonprofit funds at ECCF, and an invitation to continue the conversation individually in the coming weeks. We're going to present here for about 35-40 minutes, if all goes to plan, and then we will open it up for questions for you. So please be sure to maybe type your questions into the chat or just jot them down, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the microphone over to our President and CEO, Beth Francis, who's going to kick it off by sharing a little more about ECCF and how nonprofit funds really fit into our organization. So,
thanks, Stacey. Good morning to you all, and I do appreciate you taking the time to join us today. So let me tell you a little bit about ECCF and our work. You know, philanthropy is really what our community foundation does. It's what we're all about. For those who might be new to us, our mission since we began about 22 years ago is to inspire philanthropy that strengthens, and believe it or not, the 34 cities and towns in Essex County. Most people don't know that there are 34 different cities and towns that make up our region. And we care about each and every one of those and the work that is being done in our communities. We do this with tools like charitable funds where donors can have impact with their giving. And we do it for about 240 donors. We call them fund holders here at ECCF. And these 240 funds mean that more than $100 million in charitable assets are invested by our community foundation for charitable purposes and for grant making, not just for today, but also into the future. More than 50% of these funds are what we would call donor advised funds. I'm sure you've heard of them. But we also have other types of funds, scholarship funds, field of interest funds, what we call designated funds. And we also have funds specifically for nonprofit agencies. So we also know that the nonprofit community is absolutely essential in achieving our mission. It's our duty and our role as a community foundation to act as a support system for the nonprofit sector in our county. Up to this point, you've probably interacted with ECCF by applying for or receiving a grant from one of our 240 funds, or maybe you've attended one of our capacity building workshops or a community event that we've hosted or by us or by one of our partners. Today, we're here to introduce you to another aspect of our work, and it's called a nonprofit charitable fund and what it can do to support an organization's mission. While we've had nonprofit funds here at the Community Foundation for a long time, we have recently become proactive in sharing this information with nonprofits because of our community leadership work. In the past few years, ECCF has been strategic in deploying our cross-sector convening power and our charitable resources to address root causes of big and systemic issues that we see across our county. You might be familiar with our, for our arts organizations, the $2.3 million Creative County Initiative, or for our organizations who work with individuals and families from low-income households. You might know about our $1.5 million Empowering Economic Opportunity Initiative. But what I wanted to talk about and what's relevant today in our conversation is our community leadership work in crisis response. I never expected that ECCF would be a leader in this arena, but sadly, we have needed to fill this role between the gas explosions in the Merrimack Valley and now COVID. We've become a lead organization when resources need to be raised and need to be deployed strategically, effectively, and I think in a lot of terms require an integrity for the disbursement of funds during the crisis. What we've learned through our disaster relief efforts, besides the unbelievable value of our nonprofits and the role they play in the social sector, it's that the fiscal health of our nonprofits are vital and need to be sustainable to weather the storm in times of crisis. We've known for years that a best practice for nonprofits is to have at least 6 months or more of liquid assets set aside. But never before did we think in such real, tangible terms about our ability to plan for the future as a means of actual survival. So this pandemic has certainly changed that for all of us, regardless of the size of the organization or the longevity of the nonprofit. There's a new emphasis on how we can think about the future, how we raise funds for our organization's short and long-term needs, and how those funds are invested to meet the organization's goals. And we think at ECCF we can help nonprofits in this endeavor. We have a specific type of fund at ECCF called a nonprofit agency fund, and we can achieve what I just talked about. We have nonprofit funds here at ECCF, and we wanted to share with you how they work, how we can partner with your organization in helping achieve your goals. So let's get started. Let me turn it over to Stacey, who's going to go into the details of what a nonprofit fund is and how we can help you at ECCF.
That is great, Beth. Thank you very much. So now that we've said, as Beth said, we've said the words nonprofit funds 100 times, let's actually dive in to understand what they're all about. So Essex County nonprofit organizations establish nonprofit funds to help protect and grow medium to long-term assets, while also providing annual distributions that are used in support of the nonprofit's charitable purposes, programs, and operations. And we're going to break all of that down a bit. We offer 2 types of funds for nonprofits. It's a nonprofit endowment fund and a nonprofit reserve fund. And we're going to talk about both of those as well. ECCF handles the administration of the fund, from investment management to administering disbursements. And we're always here a phone call away, or really an email away, to partner with you and to answer any questions. Our nonprofit funds at ECCF can be established with $25,000 or more. And our total fees are assessed based on both the fund size and the pooled investment fund the nonprofit chooses to invest its assets in. And you guessed it, we're going to learn a little bit more about that later too. So how does it actually work? For those of us who are visual learners.
Stacey?
Yeah?
Sorry, I don't think your slides are advancing. Just wanted to
oh boy.
Know that.
Oh, okay. That's not ideal. How about now?
There you go.
Hold on. Right there?
There you go.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sorry about that. So This infographic, for those visual learners that can see it now, will help you really understand it's very easy to follow. So first, a 501c3 nonprofit organization establishes a nonprofit fund with ECCF with a really simple fund agreement. The nonprofit will then choose one of the two pooled investment funds we offer to invest assets in. ECCF then receives contributions directly from the nonprofit and deposits them into the fund. The assets are invested, they grow over time, and upon request, ECCF processes distributions back to the nonprofit. That little star is there because the main difference between a reserve fund and an endowed fund is really in how a nonprofit can access the assets in the fund, and so we're going to talk about that next. Every nonprofit fund will have access to our online donor portal, which we call Donor Central, which will allow you to view your fund's information 24/7 online and to request standard distributions. Did the slide move forward?
We're on reserve versus endowed fund now.
Brilliant. Thanks for hanging in there, everybody. So now we'll dive a little bit deeper into the nitty gritty and review both the reserve funds and endowment funds. So first, reserve. The best way to think about these funds is really to think about them as a rainy day fund. Though they can be used for things like capital campaigns and special project fundraising, easiest sort of straightforward way is to think about it as a rainy day fund. As Beth mentioned, it's and as we all know, it's really a nonprofit best practice to have 3 to 6 months of working capital and liquid assets set aside to help sustain operations if, say, a revenue source doesn't come through or an unbudgeted expense comes up. These funds, while available for use when you deem it necessary, are really better thought of as untouchable, right? Separate from an operating account that you're using to pay for your ordinary expenses. And that's why a nonprofit reserve fund is a really great home for these types of assets. A reserve fund holds and protects medium to long-term assets that nonprofits intend to keep in perpetuity, but offers flexibility to access them when the need arises. So here's how it works per the chart before. Funds come into the reserve fund, they're invested and they grow over time. ECCF works with you to consider an appropriate annual distribution, and that can be defined by a predetermined amount that you and your board have determined, or by ECCF spending policy. Now, everybody buckle up for this. Currently, ECCF spending policy is calculated as 4.5% of the market value of all endowed funds over the preceding 20 quarters. Now, that is set to preserve the principal balance of the fund while also making income available for use. I am certain there will be questions about that later, and absolutely we will get into that. So back into the reserve fund, a nonprofit can easily request this distribution at any time, and ECCF will process the request and send you the funds. You always have the choice, by the way, to access less than the annual distribution you anticipated taking, which means that whatever is not utilized is folded back into the fund. If a nonprofit chooses to access more than they anticipated in a reserve fund, well, the reserve fund allows for that to happen up to the full balance of the fund. So when to access the fund, how much to access is really up to the discretion of the nonprofit. Full flexibility is really the key here. So now let's take a look at the endowment fund. Similarly, these are made up of assets that a nonprofit intends to maintain in perpetuity, but would also enjoy and appreciate an annual distribution from to utilize for its operations, programs, and programs in service of its mission. I once heard somebody call a distribution from an endowment as golden funds. So it's not money you have to go out and raise or earn directly from an earned income strategy. It's golden. You'll see here that for an endowment fund, and this is important, that the annual distribution is based entirely on ECCF spending policy. A nonprofit may access up to or less than that amount by simply requesting a distribution. And here's where the real difference lies. A nonprofit may only access assets beyond the annual spending amount in the case of extreme need. How that extreme need is defined is really up to the nonprofit and the nonprofit's board of directors. And once that need is identified, the request to access the funds in excess of the spending policy comes with board approval, and there's a process for that on our end. And all requests above the spending policy is reviewed by ECCF's Board of Trustees. So I know that that's a lot of information. So here is my, where I like to give an oversimplified metaphor to try and easily demonstrate the difference between a reserve fund and endowed fund and how they are utilized. Does everybody see a cookie jar? Brilliant. A Santa themed one too. Okay, so let's say you have a cookie jar on your kitchen counter. And listen, it's the holidays, it's the middle of a pandemic. Like, we know we're all gonna have cookie jars filled with cookies on our counter. In this case, you've entrusted your cookie jar to ECCF, and with that, you've also entrusted the goals and the plans that you have for those cookies in the cookie jar. The spending policy on the cookie jar, if you will, limits you to 2 cookies, and we are going to hold you to that as best we can. With a reserve fund, you can easily access those 2 cookies, and you do, and they are delish, and they are so delish, in fact, that you decide that you're going to take out 5 more cookies to share them with your family in pursuit of the goals that you set forth for these cookies in this cookie jar. And ECCF says, absolutely, take those cookies. Same scenario, but now your cookie jar is an endowed fund cookie jar. You can have those first 2 cookies, and we hope you enjoy them because they too are delish. When you come back to the cookie jar to get 5 more cookies for your family, ECCF is going to gently remind you that you put those cookies there for a longer term goal. You are actually hoping that these cookies turn into more cookies. Still, if it so happens that you look around your home and you don't have another morsel of holiday goodness for your family, you and your family can request that we open the cookie jar, at which time ECCF will consider your request and will work with you to get you the cookies that you need. So the idea here is really to demonstrate that the type of nonprofit fund you open should be in alignment with your nonprofit organization's goals and capabilities. It's also to share that there are actually nonprofits that have both a reserve fund and an endowment fund with different sets of goals connected to each. It is very clearly a decision that involves weighing many factors, and just being beyond the holder of the cookie jar, ECCF is here to help you think through all of that if and when it is helpful to you. So with that, at the very beginning of this presentation, we acknowledge that there's many of you listening today, you have your own thoughts and ideas around how a nonprofit fund might help you. We're going to bring Beth back here to share some real life examples of actual nonprofits that opened funds with us at ECCF to share their goals and the opportunities that drove them to do so. So Beth.
Great. So hopefully you understand that there's lots of choices when you're thinking about what to do with capital assets from your nonprofit. For as many nonprofits as there are in Essex County, and hold on your seat, there's over 4,000 registered nonprofits in Essex County. What I've learned is that there are just as many circumstances, goals, and planning strategies for the future as there are different needs in nonprofits. So I thought what might be helpful is to just give you a few tangible examples of what we mean when we share the type of nonprofit funds that we have here at ECCF. So just a first example, we have a nonprofit fund here whose goal was to build charitable assets for long-term sustainability. This nonprofit had a donor who came to them and said, I think unless you put aside some resources that can grow over time, I'm worried that in the next 15 years, we will be sustainable as an organization to achieve our mission. So this small but mighty nonprofit, with the first gift of this donor, opened a fund that continues to grow each and every year. It's an endowed fund here, and they take a small grant disbursement from that operating budget each year for their operating budget. But their strategy was to grow an asset long-term so that they could have long-term sustainability. Just to give you another example, we have another fund who had a $100,000 CD. It was invested, it was due to mature, it had a very modest interest rate over time. And a board member with this nonprofit was also a fund holder here, a DAF, a donor advised fund holder here. And he was sharing at their investment committee the returns that he gets on his charitable fund, and said, hey, they have a nonprofit fund, maybe we should look into it. nonprofit chose to cash in the CD and move the $100,000 here to a reserve fund here at ECCF. It wasn't capital that they could invest long term. They needed access to that should they have a rainy day, and they were letting the fund grow for the next few years here. And they have not needed to take a grant, but they have that available should they need to do that. Another one with a short-term goal, and sometimes a nonprofit fund here can be used for something like a capital campaign. We have a fund, it's a church that has a fund here. It's going to take them 3 years to raise their funds, and they wanted to put the assets into something that could grow, but in a conservative growth pattern. So they had choices in that investment. But they wanted a trusted partner for their donors so that they knew that those assets that were being raised for a specific purpose would be used for a specific purpose. And that while the church raised those resources, that they would be able to do their expansion project and use those assets when that time came. A nonprofit fund can also be used for a special purpose. So in this case, a small nonprofit who it was a founder who founded the organization was retiring after 10 years. The organization had matured and they had a board and they do great work in Essex County, and they decided they wanted to honor her, the founder, and raised an endowed fund and a fundraising effort with their donors to name the fund after her. And it is an endowed fund here at the Community Foundation where they draw 4.5% every year, and it will grow over time for the sustainability of the organization. So you can see, this is not so much about a one-size-fits-all resource, but more a journey to see how this resource can serve your nonprofit's specific goals and circumstances. I just wanted you to understand that there are lots of different ways in which you can think about a nonprofit fund for us. I've safeguarded the names of, the examples that I shared, but I do actually have permission to share one that I wanted to share with you from Essex County Habitat for Humanity. It's a testimonial as to why they chose ECCF as a partner. And I wanted to read this to you, and we're going to talk next about exactly the benefits and why having a fund here at ECCF will, what we think can help make the difference for you. This was Dick Sundberg. He is the board president of the brand new Essex County Habitat for Humanity. For those who don't know, Merrimack Valley Habitat, North Shore Habitat just actually recently merged. But the Merrimack Valley Habitat had their endowed fund here with us. He says we wanted ECCF's investment committee to manage the assets so that we could concentrate on our mission of providing every family in Essex County with a decent place to live. And we're going to talk about our investment committee in a second. We wanted a trusted institution to be the custodian of our funds. We'll talk a little bit about that. We appreciate the fact that the management fees paid to ECCF will be reinvested in the nonprofits in Essex County, and we'll share a little bit about that. And we recognize that the benefits of ECCF's learning and networking opportunities for our staff and volunteers. And so our family of nonprofit agency funds, have the benefits of some of the things that we do outside of charitable funds and the work that we do. And so in this case, Dick really feels strongly about the work of the Habitat for Humanity and the impact that we can have here in growing their funds for the future. So I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Britt Hutchins, who's going to we're going to dive into the first part of the benefits of having this at ECCF, which is the investments of the funds.
Thanks, Beth. Sorry, lost my mouse there. Thanks everybody. I'm actually new to ECCF. Been on for about 3 months, but what drew me to ECCF was unique ability to focus on ECCF, but also know that over the past 3 years through Lawrence and COVID, the professionalism in ECCF is really quite amazing. And I think when you look at your own nonprofit and then ECCF's, we're all in this together. And I think that is really important. But as Beth said, one of the special sauces that ECCF brings to nonprofit funds is the investment committee. I think it's important to know that it's a board committee. It has board members as well as individual members, and they have a charge to manage the assets of ECCF as well as of its agency fund and nonprofit funds. And they do that with prudence, professionalism, and governance. When we talk about prudence, that's the prudent man rule, and putting the assets of the nonprofits ahead of those of their own. These are seasoned managers, and what do I mean by that? They have well over 100 years of working in the industry. Most are CFAs, if not all, and they sit on not only ECCF's investment committee, but they also sit on investment committees of other endowments in and around Boston area. So some have been in very prominent organizations like Wellington, and some have had their own shop. So I think they bring a great professionalism to the investment management process here. And then finally, governance. We have MIFA, which is the Uniform Prudent Investment of Foundation Assets. So and all of that, and then the management of the investment policy statement and derivative, and that, as well as manager selection of the various funds, as well as investment performance. So the investment committee is really responsible for those three things, and as a board subcommittee. Let me take a second to talk about investment strategy. Now, investment strategy within ECCF really is to target steady asset growth while managing the risk and the costs. And the idea behind that is we need to grow assets here, and that's we're not gonna. That's the idea of having the endowment. It's the idea for having a reserve fund, because not all of your assets should be or are for immediate use. There are endowed assets for long-term use, as Beth stated, in growing the church's endowment or capital campaign, that they shouldn't all be in cash or whatever, which leads to really what ECCF does in its investment strategy is to preserve and grow the real purchasing power. That's to get out of and ahead of the cost of inflation and really grow real assets. But also knowing that you have to have a level of current spending that handles your programmatic goals, your gifts and your grants going out to the needy people in which your mission is served. So that's kind of the investment strategy. We can dive into that in the Q&A if we want to dive into it more. But let me take a second about the philosophy of the investment committee. The idea behind this is that larger, more liquid asset classes and the lower expected excess return achieved by active managers. What that says is that the bigger the asset class, the harder it is for active managers to find alpha or real returns. And so what they do in order to get excessive returns is to pick an area to focus on, whether that's style, which is growth versus value, or size. We're going to focus on small cap or large cap. We're only going to focus on utilities as opposed to technology, or some sort of other style or some sort of other area. But the investment committee really focuses on that active managers, if they focus on that, really leads to a bias. And so that then they get kind of pigeonholed into thinking about that one style or size or liquidity or sector. And that's been proven out in academic studies. But more importantly, I think the investment committee feels that the largest determinant of aggregate investment returns in a multi-asset portfolio is really focused on disciplined asset allocation. We are going to focus on small cap because we believe that over the long term, an overweighting in small cap will be better for the overall funds. Or we will decide that international stocks are undervalued, and so we will put more value in the international asset class. And so I think that is what, that is the secret sauce, and the investment committee believes that that will lead to longer, better investment returns over the benchmark. And so in doing that, they look at the passive management of the underlying asset class. So that would mean investing in small cap index funds or ETFs, or large cap index ETFs, and using asset allocation as a way of saying, well, we believe small caps are undervalued at this point, so we will allocate some money into that. And that's how the investment philosophy, and that's kind of the investment philosophy. So in summary, really kind of look at passive vehicles, but active asset allocation. So Stacey, next slide. So what does that mean? Well, we have at ECCF, we have two investment pools. One is called the general fund and the other is ESG fund. The general fund really is a global balanced investment strategy. We invest across the S&P 500. We invest across medium and small cap asset classes, as well as international stocks. And that would make up the 65% of the equities. 35% of the other side is bonds. That would include high yield, straight run-of-the-mill corporate bonds, as well as international bonds. There's roughly about 80 million in assets at the end of October, and we are beating the benchmark for the one-year return at almost 6% versus a benchmark of 5.17. So that's the general. There's and that's where a lot of our nonprofits have put their assets in the either in a reserve fund or as an endowed fund. We have a relatively new fund, which is our ESG fund. Really only close to 10 million in assets right now. It seeks funds and managers with an ESG bent. So that'll include ETFs. It includes the Calvert group of families of funds, really focused on sustainable environmental principles, proactive social responsibility. Once again, 65-35 split, and pretty good return. We're about four percentage points, full percentage points again above the benchmark that we have right there. But I think the last bullets, one of the, besides the investment committee and the experience of the investment committee, I think putting your money with ECCF, you enjoy leverage, economies of scale, portfolio diversification, but most importantly, I think you would gain access. And what do I mean by access? Well, it's the access to tools, to research, to institutional funds. We have access to funds that are classified as institutional, which means no sales loads, no advertising fees, and cheaper costs that help us invest in the marketplace, but also not pay high fees. And I think that's an important thing to remember when you do invest with ECCF and the endowment and our endowment here. I'm going to turn it back over to Stacey. We have time for Q&A at the end. So if there are questions, I know this is a big part of it, and I'm happy to dive either as high level or as low as we need to go into this to handle it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Britt. We're gonna move through the next pieces because I imagine that there will be some questions about this coming up here at the end. So sort of following that thread that Mr. Sundberg offered in terms of benefits, you know, it's already a core element of our mission to provide the learning opportunities and capacity building that will help nonprofits thrive. And additionally, there's more of that for our nonprofit fund holders. To begin, nonprofits will receive 4 complimentary tickets to our annual Institute for Trustees conference. I'm sure many of you have attended and can speak to really the value of this, this incredible opportunity. We'll continue to host community and networking events, which as fund holders, you will actually be able to gain access to in a new way. Our capacity building workshops will continue and really be responsive to what you're seeing as nonprofit fund holders, while also offering some higher levels of individualized support and technical assistance as well. Looking forward, our hope is really to continue to grow our family of nonprofit funds, and through that establish, what we want to call a learning community, a cohort that can work together over a period of time to start to address the things that you're uniquely facing and the goals that you have related to whether it be a reserve or endowed fund. So that's, if we look through our crystal ball, that's ultimately where we hope to head. And finally, this notion of partnering with ECCF as a trusted institution. So this is a couple of snippets from our most recently released just before Thanksgiving, hot off the presses annual report, which we are very excited about. As with these numbers that you're seeing here and everything that is included in our annual report, it is a celebration of our mission and our ability to support you, that the nonprofits in Essex County. Like you, we are a nonprofit. We are committed to making life in Essex County that much better for all of us. And our role as a community foundation is in such a sweet one, and that we really get to inspire and catalyze resources, be it financial resources and people resources, to get behind you and your work as a nonprofit community. And that's why this opportunity to partner with ECCF through these nonprofit funds comes with a promise of partnership that we know other providers or investment managers quite honestly can't offer in the same way. A very simple but poignant example is to consider the fees that are associated with opening any kind of investment account. The fees charged to nonprofit funds at ECCF are not only competitive, they go to fuel the very work that we are celebrating in our annual report. It's the work that we do to support you in the nonprofit community. When we increase our ability to support you, we all benefit. And that's a really unique aspect to our partnership. And we really know that that matters to you as well. I hope that so far you've learned a little bit more about how this might be a tool for you and how we can be a unique partner. We're going to shift a little bit now to the question and answer, pretty much right on time, not bad. And as we do, I want to invite you, to continue the conversation you're having internally about how a nonprofit fund can support you, and to welcome us into those conversations to help you start thinking strategically about how we can support you in your efforts and your goals. So with that, I'm just going to unshare so you can see pretty faces. And hi everybody. So I know that there was one question in the chat that was somewhat answered, and it was related to social screens for investment. So we talked about our ESG funds. Does anybody else have a question that they'd like to ask to get things started? Probably unmute yourself or give me a little wave. Seeing your name, Ray and Marilyn Smith. Great, Marilyn, right. Great, perfect.
Yeah, I'm on the board of the Lynn Community Health Centre. I was just curious to know, you mentioned fees. I was just curious to know what your fees are and what percentage of the fees goes to that you reinvest in the charitable purposes.
Perfect. Marilyn, we anticipated this question, so I appreciate you very much being the first one brave enough to ask. So The fees that we charge here to all of our funds at Essex County Community Foundation are really made up of two different types of fees. There are our foundation fees and our investment fees. So for our foundation fee, and that's really our admin fee. It depends on the size and the type of your fund. So for a nonprofit fund, the floor of, and I should say it's a sliding scale that will goes down, the fee goes down as the asset size goes up. So we review our fees annually. And right now, the floor is at 75 basis points. So from $25,000 to about $250,000, that's where it goes. And then it will go down gradually from there. The other side of it is the investment fee, and that's going to be really made up of really third-party investment manager costs and a small investment oversight fee. For right now, our general fund, the investment fee is 43 basis points, and the ESG fund is 52 basis points. So what you would do is you would add those two things together, and that would be your total annual fee assessed to the fund. So example, $100,000 nonprofit fund invested into the ESG fund would have 75 basis points plus a 52, I'm doing this in my head I have it written somewhere. 75 plus 52, which is 1.27%. And that's assessed on an annual basis.
And
the
all
piece
of
that
those,
goes back, yeah, go ahead,
sorry, go ahead, Stacey.
Nope, you got it.
I was just gonna say, all of those fees go back into the sort of the operation and funding the community foundation and the work that we're doing.
Okay, so you're not paying high-powered money managers or anything like that. That's all taken care of in the fees.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yes.
And then
Mr. Brown, Jim Brown.
The investment fees, as Britt said earlier, the investment fees, we try to sort of, our goal is to have extremely low investment fees. That is our goal. I mean, obviously to optimize return, sometimes you need to pay a little bit more, but we keep a keen eye on that.
Right. I noticed your returns, 1-year returns were actually pretty good. Was that just this current year? Because I know it's been a little strange this year. Things do seem to be higher right now.
We've had a good, I should have it in front of me. We've had a very strong 3-year set of returns. Again, what Britt talked about is those small changes that it's a passive approach, but what our investment committee is doing in making those small changes about moving a % or 2 out of US stocks into international stocks or vice versa, depending on where things are at, are what's allowing us to beat the benchmark. And so we've actually had strong 1-year returns, 3-year returns, quarter returns. And as crazy as the market has been over the course of this pandemic, doing well as well. And our goal is we pay attention to the benchmark and make those small modifications in an attempt to do that.
And I'll just add a quick little bit. I'm going to follow with our latest investment performance reports on both funds, and I'll also send you all a link to where you can see them updated on a monthly basis. There was a quick follow-up question from Mark Carlson, and then I'll go to you, Jim Brown. What are the benchmarks? Is that something that Britt, you want to tackle?
Yeah, so they're actually on the investment performance to send out. It depends on what it is. So the benchmark for equities, it comprises of the S&P 500, the Barclays aggregate. Shoot, I don't have it the top of my head, but Barclays aggregate. There's also an international benchmark on the international stocks. It's Russell 2000 for the small cap benchmark. So,
if I could just interrupt you, is there a comparison between what ECCF is using for their benchmark against comparable community foundation growth? So like if I was at Common Fund, they might use the NBOA, or a similar kind of industry benchmark.
We are not. We are benchmarking to a set based on the traditional allocation that the board has set forth. So we take a specific set of the percentage of the S&P 500, another percentage for the Russell. So we don't adjust that benchmark, but we do just peg it like that. But the answer to your question is no, we don't benchmark it to, I forget what your benchmark was, but that you mentioned, but
We're not comparing it to other foundations. We're comparing it to the market.
Okay.
Jim Brown, I'm gonna
Thanks.
unmute you. Go ahead.
Thanks. I have it's a very simple question, but it's one that I know would be raised by my board. Were the returns that you guys posted or put in the presentation, I'm sure that you show, are they net of the fees or are they gross returns? In other words,
Net of
so
fees.
They're net.
right?
They're
net
net.
of fees.
So that's the actual return to the entity itself.
Yes.
Okay,
Mhm.
that's good to know. I mean,
Great.
they're going to ask, so thank you.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
as they should.
Anybody else? I'm scanning the crowd. See anybody?
One of the things I'll just mention for more of the nonprofit leadership perspective that's on the call right now, one of the things that when I joined ECCF that really struck me about these nonprofit funds, in my past life, earlier in my career, I ran a nonprofit, and we had an endowment and had a reserve fund, and I think we had it living with a third-party investment management firm. And to be quite frank, I didn't really know what it was doing, how it was invested, what was going on with it. I mean, occasionally I would check it and I would look into it, and it was growing, I guess, and I was happy. But I didn't necessarily have the sort of the confidence in the oversight and the intelligence to know what was happening with that and what the fees were and how that compared. And I didn't have the time because I was so busy with everything else to even go and consider and think about, what was happening there. That was something else, an endowment, a reserve fund. It was a couple $100,000. It wasn't a ton of money, but it was certainly important to our operation, but I had it over there. And so when I learned about the ECCF nonprofit funds, what I enjoyed about that was the mission alignment with if I was running a nonprofit, if I had sort of partnered with ECCF, I would have had that level of confidence that the mission was aligned on the investment strategy, and the confidence that, they were looking out for my interests as far as maximizing my returns and minimizing my costs. And not something that I necessarily had that confidence within the third party. So it's just something as a leadership, so a nonprofit leadership hat, as well as a board member hat, I guess too, it's something to consider and think about as you think about your own sort of, current endowments or reserve funds that you might have as you think about them.
Great. Thank you for that, Stratton. That's a really important perspective. So we've got about 7 minutes left. Mark, I see you've unmuted yourself, so we're going to chat. And then there's a question from Lindsay in the chat that we'll get to after Mark. So go ahead.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I've used Common Fund for many years, had a great relationship with them, and they have an institute at the Common Fund. But I think what makes this a little bit sexier from a donor perspective is that, you can sort of put up there the fact if you want to raise money for your endowment, that you can highlight the benefits of ECCF. Is it something that a donor could directly contribute through you as a conduit, or do they need to come through us in terms of making a contribution? Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Another perfectly timed and anticipated question, Mark. Well done. So as you saw sort of in that infographic, right, that 90% of the contributions that we expect to come into the nonprofit funds are going to come directly from the nonprofit, right? You have relationships with donors, you want to run them through your own kind of acknowledgement system, and that, if you have the ability with your own 501c3, obviously to offer that tax deduction and all of that stuff that they're looking for. We also know that there are going to be some donors, and there's going to be some particularly perhaps more complex assets that could require some additional support and partnership from ECCF. And really what we say is, let's consider that on an individual basis. The answer is, we are working within our own capacity constraints, right? but for the right donor and the right fund at the right time, that's definitely something that we want to be able to talk about and to offer as a support. I'll look to Beth and to just see if there's anything else you wanted to add there, Beth.
Yeah, I think it, if it's a stock transfer and you're an organization that doesn't have a setup for stock transfers, as an example, appreciated securities, we would certainly be able to work with your donor to do that, to meet the need that you may have. But I would say part of the reason that our fees are what they are is we would expect that we're receiving the largest sum of dollars coming from the organization itself, meaning that we have less gifts to process in order for us to charge the rates that we are. However, we're here. We accept complex assets as a part of our gift acceptance policy. And when you have that kind of donor that has an interest in doing that, we would work with you and the donor together to make that happen.
Great. There's some more questions coming in that we may not get to. So I just want to acknowledge that I will follow up with everybody with answers to those questions and then opportunities to discuss individually. That's really, really what hopefully this is all about. But Lindsay asked, can you speak to the liquidity and rules regarding frequency of deposit/withdrawal guidelines for non-endowed funds? So I think I will answer as what I think you're asking. So for a reserve fund, the minimum to open a reserve fund is $25,000. It is invested, and ultimately, as we said, we can sort of work with you to say what kind of access do you want to it on an annual basis. It's important to think about these funds as separate than your operating account, right? Like these are not accounts that you really want to think about withdrawing from as 3 or 4 times a month, right? Because the idea is that these are assets that you set aside for growth. And so as far as I'm aware, there aren't any rules around how many times you can request a withdrawal or how often you do, for what amount. I mean, that's what the reserve fund is really for, is that it offers that level of flexibility, but it's just really about thinking about the use of that fund and in the short term and in the long term. So hopefully that helps, Lindsay.
You can make as many deposits as you want.
Yes, that too.
Normally what we see with a nonprofit agency fund, just to give you some perspective as a tangibility to your question, is we generally see one annual grant disbursement or we see a couple in a year. We don't typically see a monthly deduction. So I don't know if that helps just give you some, examples of how that has worked.
Okay. Couple more.
Jim's got a question.
Is that Jim? Jim?
You're muted, Jim.
Hold on one
Thanks. Okay. I just had a kind of a follow-up on this, and it goes back to the fee structure. And I think you said that the fee was 75 basis points for the first up to 250,000, and then it stepped down after that. And I don't know if there's a similar change with respect to the outside, but I assume at the outside, that's just determined by each fund. And that doesn't have to do with the size of the investment. That's just the fund's fees, right? In terms of okay. But in terms of your fees, if I have 350,000, am I paying 75 basis points on the first 250 and then something less thereafter? Or am I paying the lesser amount on everything because I'm above 250?
The former. If I've got this right, it's the former. So it's 75 basis points on the first 250, and then I think it's 50. Stacey, I'm forgetting what the second tier is, but
yes, 50
basis points.
Yep.
On the next 100 grand.
So my average cost goes down the more I have invested. Fair enough.
Correct.
Okay. That's what I wanted to understand. Thank you.
Yep.
Stacey has some questions regarding the minimum investment levels and reporting.
Okay. We've got 1 minute left, so let's see if we can, let's see this. It says, could you please talk about your process for reporting performance?
So we report performance every month. We have it's up on our website right now. We haven't done November yet, but it's up through October. We have an investment sheet that has both the ESG and the general fund. Also in the slides on the appendix will be a list of the assets that we are invested in right now.
Great.
I didn't want to get
Yeah.
into that.
And I'll just add, in addition to that, you have access to online portal system, which you can at your fingertips run what the recent months returns have been into your fund, the dividends. And then there's also quarterly reports that you can download for your boards that show the quarterly dividend returns into the fund. And you can actually see that in there as well. So you have access to that virtually. Digitally, did I say virtually? I don't even know what the right word is, but you have access to it once you sign on to
We know, yeah, we know what it means. Okay, well, we folks are officially out of time, and I want to just really pause and say thank you very, very much. Hopefully you see how excited and jazzed we are about really partnering with you in this way, and that we see it as a partnership. So I will be following up with each of you with the slide deck today, as well as some our investment performance, as well as some other information to keep the conversation going. So we will certainly be in touch, and I wish you all the very best. And thank you so much.